The Story of Civilization, Volume 3, Caesar and Christ, Part 2, by Will Durant, continued, Cassette 5, Side 1. At the head of this restored prosperity was the resurrected city of Carthage. After the Battle of Actium, Augustus took up the frustrated project of Caius Gracchus and Caesar, and sent to Carthage as colonists some of the soldiers whose fidelity and victories he wished to reward with land. The geographical advantages of the site, the perfect harbor, the fertile Bagradus Delta, the excellent roads opened or reopened by Roman engineers, soon enabled Carthage to recapture from Utica the export and import trade of the region. Within a century of its refounding, it had become the largest city in the western provinces. Rich merchants and landowners built mansions on the historic Byrsa, or villas in the flowering suburbs, while peasants, driven from the soil by the competition of latifundia, joined proletarians and slaves in slums whose fetid poverty would welcome the egalitarian gospel of Christianity. Houses rose to 6 or 7 stories, public buildings gleamed with marble, and statuary of good Greek style abounded in the streets and squares. Temples were built again to the old Carthaginian gods, and Melkart enjoyed till our 2nd century the sacrifice of living children. The people rivaled the Romans in their passion for luxuries, cosmetics, jewelry, dyed hair, chariot races, and gladiatorial games. Among the sights of the city were the great public baths presented by Marcus Aurelius. There were lecture halls, schools of rhetoric, philosophy, medicine, and law. Carthage ranked only after Athens and Alexandria as a university town. Here Apuleius and Tertullian came to study everything, and St. Augustine marveled at the pranks and immorality of the students, whose favorite philanthropy was to break into a lecture room and dismiss both the professor and his class. Carthage was the capital of the province called Africa, now eastern Tunisia. South of it, commerce bedecked the eastern coast with cities whose ancient wealth was reviving after 12 centuries when war struck them in our time. Hadrumetum, now Sousse, Leptis Minor, Thapsus, and Tacapy, now Gabus. Farther east on the Mediterranean lay a district named Tripolis from its federation of 3 cities. Ia, now Tripoli, founded by the Phoenicians in 900 BC, Sabrata, and Leptis Magna, now Lebda. In this last city the Emperor Septimius Severus was born in AD 146. He rewarded it with a basilica and municipal bath whose ruins astonish the traveler or warrior today. Paved roads busy with camel caravans connected these ports with the towns of the interior. Sufatula, now a tiny village with the remains of a great Roman temple. Thysdrus, now El Gem, which had an amphitheater seating 60,000, and Thuga, now Duga, whose ruined theater attests by its graceful Corinthian columns the wealth and taste of its citizens. North of Carthage was her ancient mother and implacable rival, Utica, now Utique. We catch a hint of its Roman opulence when we learn that in 46 BC 300 Roman bankers and wholesalers had branch offices there. Its territory reached northward to Hippodioritis, now Bizerte. Thence a road led along the coast westward to Hippo Regius, now Bonn, soon to be Augustine's episcopal see. South and inland lay Cirta, now Constantine, capital of the province of Numidia. Westward lay Thamugadi, now Timgad, almost as well preserved as Pompeii, with paved and colonnaded streets, covered drains, an elegant arch, a forum, senate house, basilica, temples, baths, theater, library, and many private homes. On the pavement of the forum is a checkerboard engraved with the words Venari, Lavari, Ludere, Ridere, Hoc est vivere. To hunt, bathe, play, and laugh, this is to live. Thumagadi was founded about AD 117 by the 3rd Legion, sole guard of the African provinces. About 123 the Legion took up more permanent headquarters a few miles to the west and raised the city of Lambesis, now Lambez. The soldiers married and settled there, and lived in their homes more than in the camp. But even their praetorium was a stately and ornate edifice, whose baths were as fine as any in Africa. Outside the camp they helped to build a capitol, temples, triumphal arches, and an amphitheater where struggle and death might mitigate the monotony of their peaceful lives. That a single legion could protect all North Africa from the marauding tribes of the interior was made possible by a network of roads, military in purpose but commercial in result, binding Carthage with the Atlantic and the Sahara with the Mediterranean. The main road went westward through Sirte to Caesarea, capital of Mauritania, now Morocco. Here King Juba II taught civilization to the Mauri, or Moors, from whom the province took its ancient and modern names. Son of the Juba who had died at Thapsus, he had been taken as a child to grace Caesar's triumph in Rome. He was spared, remained as a student, and became one of the most learned scholars of his time. Augustus made him client king of Mauritania, and bade him spread among his people the classic culture he had so zealously acquired. He succeeded, being favored with a long reign of 48 years. His subjects marveled that a man could write books and yet rule so well. His son and heir was brought to Rome and starved to death by Caligula. Claudius annexed the kingdom and divided it into two provinces, Mauritania Caesariensis and Mauritania Tingitana, named from its capital Tingis, our Tangier. In these African cities there were many schools, open to the poor as well as to the rich. We hear of courses in stenography, and Juvenal calls Africa nutricula causa decorum, the nurse of barristers. It produced in this period one minor and one major author, Fronto and Apuleius. Only in its Christian heyday would African literature lead the world. Lucius Apuleius was a strange and picturesque character, far more than Montaigne undulant and diverse. Born at Madara, of high family, in A.D. 124, he studied there, at Carthage and in Athens, spent a large inheritance recklessly, wandered from city to city and from faith to faith, had himself initiated into various religious mysteries, played with magic, wrote many works on subjects ranging from theology to tooth powder, lectured at Rome and elsewhere on philosophy and religion, returned to Africa, and married at Tripoli a lady considerably richer than himself in both purse and years. Her friends and heirs apparent sued to annul the marriage, charging that he had persuaded the widow by magic arts. He defended himself before the court in an apologia that has come down to us in refurbished form. He won his case and bride, but the people persisted in believing him a magician, and their pagan posterity sought to belittle Christ by recounting the miracles of Apuleius. He spent the remainder of his days at Madara and Carthage, practicing law and medicine, letters and rhetoric. Most of his writings were on scientific and philosophical subjects. His native city raised a monument to him labeled Philosophus Platonicus, and he would be chagrined if he could return to find himself remembered only for his golden ass. It is a work akin to the Satyricon of Petronius, and even more bizarre. Originally entitled 11 Books of Transformations, it expanded fantastically a story that Lucius of Patras had told of a man changed into an ass. It is a loose concatenation of adventures, descriptions, and extraneous episodes, seasoned with magic, horror, ribaldry, and deferred piety. The Lucius of the tale tells how he wandered into Thessaly, amused himself with various maidens, and sensed everywhere around him an atmosphere of sorcery. As soon as night was past and a new day began to spring, I fortuned to awake, and rose out of my bed as half amazed, and indeed desirous to know and see some strange and marvelous things. Neither was there anything which I saw that I did believe to be the same, which it was, indeed, but everything seemed to me transformed into other shapes by the wicked power of enchantment, insomuch that I thought the stones against which I might stumble were indurate, and turned from men into that figure, and that the birds which I heard chirping, and the trees and the running waters, were changed into such feathers and leaves and fountains. And further I thought that the statues and images would by and by move, and that the walls would talk, and the kine and other brute beasts would speak and tell strange news, and that immediately I should hear some oracle from heaven and from the ray of the sun. Ready now for any adventure, Lucius rubs himself with a magic ointment, meanwhile mightily wishing to be changed into a bird. But as he rubs, he becomes a perfect ass. Thenceforth, the story records the tribulations of an ass with the sense and understanding of a man. His single consolation lies in his long ears, whereby I might hear all things that were even afar off. He will be restored to human shape, he is told, if he can find and eat a rose. He achieves this consummation after a long asyniad of vicissitudes. Disenamored of life, he turns first to philosophy, then to religion, and composes a prayer of thanksgiving to Isis, astonishingly like a Christian apostrophe to the Mother of God. He shaves his head, is received into the third order of Isaic initiates, and paves a road back to earth by revealing a dream in which Osiris, greatest of the gods, bids him go home and practice law. Few books embrace so much nonsense, but fewer still have phrased it so pleasantly. Apuleius tries every manner of style and manages each successfully. He loves most a rich and fanciful verbiage, ornate with alliteration and assonance, picturesque slang and archaic speech, sentimental diminutives, rhythmic and sometimes poetic prose. An oriental warmth of coloring accompanies here an oriental mysticism and sensuality. Perhaps Apuleius wished to suggest, from the background of his experience, that sensual indulgence is an intoxicating ferment which changes us into beasts, and that we can become human again only through the rose of wisdom and piety. He is at his best in the incidental stories caught by his powerful and perambulating ears. So an old woman comforts a kidnapped maiden by recounting the romance of Cupid and Psyche. How the son of Venus fell in love with a pretty maid, gave her every joy but that of seeing him, aroused his mother to cruel jealousy, and came to a happy ending in the skies. No artist's brush, in many an effort, has bettered the horseshrew's tongue in telling the ancient tale. 3. Spain. Crossing the straits from Tangier, we pass from one of the newest to one of the oldest provinces of Rome. Standing strategically at the door of the Mediterranean, blessed and cursed with precious minerals that soaked her soil with the blood of greed, crossed with mountain ranges that hindered communications, assimilation, and unity, Spain has felt the full fever of life from the days when old Stone Age artists painted bisons on the cave walls of Altamira down to our own disordered time. For 30 centuries, the Spaniards have been a proud and warlike people, lean and tough, stoically brave, passionate and obstinate, sober and melancholy, frugal and hospitable, courteous and chivalrous, easily provoked to hatred, more easily to love. When the Romans came, they found a population even then inextricably diverse. Iberians from Africa, perhaps, Ligurians from Italy, Celts from Gaul, and a layer of Carthaginians at the top. If we may believe their conquerors, the pre-Roman Spaniards were close to barbarism, some living in towns and houses, some in hamlets and huts and caves, sleeping on the floor or the earth and washing their teeth with urine carefully aged. The men wore black cloaks, the women long mantles and gay-colored gowns. In some parts, Strabo reprovingly adds, the women danced promiscuously with men, taking hold of their hands. As early as 2000 BC, the inhabitants of southeastern Spain, Tartessus, the Phoenician Tarshish, had developed a bronze industry whose products were sold throughout the Mediterranean. On this basis, Tartessus evolved in the 6th century BC a literature and art that claimed an antiquity of 6,000 years. Little remains of it except a few crude statues and a strange polychrome bust in sandstone, the Lady of Elche, carved on Greek models in a strong and flowing Celtic style. About 1000 BC, the Phoenicians began to tap the mineral wealth of Spain, and by 800 they had taken Cadiz and Malaga and built great temples there. Towards 500 BC, Greek colonists settled along the northeastern coast. About the same time, the Carthaginians, summoned by their Phoenician kin to help suppress a revolt, conquered Tartessus and all south and eastern Spain. The rapid exploitation of the peninsula by Carthage between the First and Second Punic Wars opened the eyes of the Romans to the resources of what they then called Iberia, and the passage of Hannibal into Italy was finally outweighed by the movement of the Scipios into Spain. The disunited tribes fought fiercely for their independence. Women killed their children rather than let them fall into Roman hands, and captive natives sang their war songs while dying on the cross. The conquest took 2 centuries, but once completed it proved more fundamental than in most other provinces. The Gracchi, Caesar and Augustus, changed the Republic's policy of ruthlessness to one of courtesy and consideration, with good and lasting results. Romanization proceeded rapidly. Latin was adopted and adapted. The economy expanded and prospered, and soon Spain was contributing poets, philosophers, senators, and emperors to Rome. From Seneca to Aurelius, Spain was the economic mainstay of the empire. Having enriched Tyre and then Carthage, Spanish minerals now enriched Rome. Spain became to Italy what Mexico and Peru would be to Spain. Gold, silver, copper, tin, iron, lead were mined with modern thoroughness. At Rio Tinto one may still see Roman shafts sunk to great depths through solid quartz, and Roman slag with an astonishingly low percentage of copper left in it. In these mines, slaves and prisoners worked day after day, in many cases never seeing the light of the sun for months. Great metallurgical industries rose near the mines. Meanwhile, the soil of Spain, despite mountains and arid wastes, produced esparto grass for cord, rope, baskets, bedding, and sandals, nourished prize sheep and a renowned woolen industry, and gave to the empire the best olives, oil, and wine that antiquity knew. The Guadalquivir, the Tagus, the Ebro, and lesser streams helped a web of Roman roads to carry the products of Spain to her ports and innumerable towns. Indeed, the most remarkable and characteristic result of Roman rule, here as elsewhere, was the multiplication or expansion of cities. In the province of Baetica, now Andalusia, were Cartia, now Algeciras, Munda, Malacca, Italica, birthplace of Trajan and Hadrian, Corduba, Hispalis, now Seville, and Gades, now Cadiz. Corduba, founded 152 B.C., was a literary center famous for its schools of rhetoric. Here were born Lucan, the Senecas, and St. Paul's Gallio. This tradition of scholarship would last through the Dark Ages and make Cordoba the most learned city in Europe. Gades was the most populous of Spanish towns and notoriously rich. Situated at the mouth of the Guadalquivir, it commanded the Atlantic trade with Western Africa, Spain, Gaul, and Britain. Its sensuous dancing girls, or puellae gaditanae, contributed modestly to its fame. Rome knew Portugal as the province of Lusitania and Lisbon as Olisipo. At Norba Caesarina, to which the Arabs gave its present name of Alcantara, or the bridge, Trajan's engineers threw across the Tagus the most perfect of existing Roman bridges. Its majestic arches, 100 feet wide and 180 above the stream, still carry a busy four-lane road. The capital of Lusitania was Emerita, now Merida, which boasted many temples, 3 aqueducts, a circus, a theater, a naumachia, and a bridge 2,500 feet long. Farther east, in the province of Tarraconensis, Segovia still enjoys the pure water brought in by an aqueduct built in Trajan's reign. South of it was Toletum, now Toledo, known in Roman times for its ironworks. On the eastern coast rose the great city of Novo Carthago, now Cartagena, rich with mining, fisheries, and trade. Out in the Mediterranean lay the Baleares, where Palma and Palencia were already old and flourishing cities. Northward on the coast were Valencia, Taraco, now Tarragona, Barcino, now Barcelona, and just below the Pyrenees, the old Greek town of Emporii. A short sail around the eastern end of the mountains, and the traveler found himself in Gaul. 4. Gaul. In those days, when all ships were of moderate draft, even ocean-going vessels could navigate the Rhone from Marseille to Lyon. Smaller boats could continue to within 30 miles of the upper Rhine. After a short haul over level land, goods could sail by 100 cities and 1,000 villas into the North Sea. Similar overland leaps led from the Rhone and the Saône to the Loire and the Atlantic, from the Aude to the Garonne and Bordeaux, from the Saône to the Seine and the English Channel. Trade followed these waterways and created cities at their meeting points. France, like Egypt, was the gift of her streams. In a sense, French civilization began with Aurignacian man, 30,000 years before Christ. For even then, as the caves of Montignac attest, there were artists capable of rich color and vivid line. From that old stone age of hunting and herding, France passed about 12,000 B.C. to the settled life and tillage of the Neolithic Age, and after 10 long millenniums to the Age of Bronze. About 900 B.C. a new race, Alpine and round-headed, began to filter in from Germany and spread across France to Britain and Ireland and down into Spain. These Celts brought with them the Hallstatt iron culture of Austria, and about 550 B.C. they imported from Switzerland the more developed iron technology of La Tène. When Rome became conscious of France, she named it Celtica. Only in Caesar's time was this name changed to Gallia, or Gaul. The immigrants displaced some native groups and settled down in independent tribes whose names still lurk in the cities they built. The Gauls, said Caesar, were tall, muscular, and strong. They combed their rich blond hair back over their heads and down the nape of their necks. Some had beards, many had powerful mustaches curling around their mouths. They had brought from the East, perhaps from the ancient Iranians, the custom of wearing breeches. To these they added tunics dyed in many colors and embroidered with flowers, and striped cloaks fastened at the shoulders. They loved jewelry and wore gold ornaments, even if nothing else, in war. They liked abundant meat, beer, and undiluted wine, being intemperate by nature, if we may believe Appian. Strabo calls them simple and high-spirited, boastful, insufferable when victorious, scared out of their wits when defeated. But it is not always a boon that our enemies should write a book. Posidonius was shocked to find out that they hung the severed heads of their foes from the necks of their horses. They were easily aroused to argument and combat, and sometimes, to amuse themselves at banquets, they fought duels to the death. They were, says Caesar, our equals in valor and warlike zeal. Ammianus Marcellinus describes them as, at all ages, fit for military service. The old man marches out on a campaign with courage equal to that of the man in the prime of life. In fact, a whole band of foreigners will be unable to cope with one Gaul if he call in his wife, who is usually far stronger and fiercer than he, above all when she swells her neck, gnashes her teeth, and, poising her huge arms, begins to rain down blows and kicks like shots from a catapult. The Gauls believed in a variety of gods, now too dead to mind anonymity. Belief in a pleasant life after death was so keen as to be, in Caesar's judgment, an important source of Gallic bravery. On the strength of it, says Valerius Maximus, men lent money to be repaid in heaven. And Posidonius claimed to have seen Gauls at a funeral write letters to their friends in the other world and throw them upon the pyre so that the dead man might deliver them. We should enjoy a Gaul's opinion of these Roman tales. A priestly class, the Druids, controlled all education and vigorously inculcated religious belief. They conducted a colorful ritual in sacred groves more often than in temples, and to appease the gods they offered human sacrifice of men condemned to death for crime. The custom will appear barbarous to those who have not seen an electrocution. The Druids were the only learned, perhaps the only literate part of the community. They composed hymns, poems, and historical records. They studied the stars and their movements, the size of the universe and the earth, and the order of nature, and formulated a practicable calendar. They served as judges and had great influence at the courts of the tribal kings. Pre-Roman, like medieval Gaul, was a political feudalism clothed in theocracy. Under these kings and priests, Celtic Gaul reached its zenith in the 4th century B.C. Population expanded with the productivity of the Latin techniques, and the result was a series of wars for land. About 400 B.C., the Celts, who already held most of Central Europe as well as Gaul, conquered Britain, Spain, and North Italy. In 390 they pushed south to Rome. In 278 they pillaged Delphi and conquered Phrygia. A century later, their vigor began to wane, partly through the softening influence of wealth and Greek ways, partly through the political atomism of feudal barons. Just as in medieval France, the kings broke the power of the barons and established a unified state, conversely, in the century before Caesar, the lords of the manors broke the power of the kings and left Gaul more fragmentary than before. The Celtic front was pushed back everywhere except in Ireland. The Carthaginians subdued the Celts in Spain, the Romans drove them out of Italy, the Cimbrian Teutons overran them in Germany and southern Gaul. In 125 B.C., the Romans, eager to control the road to Spain, conquered southern Gaul and made it a Roman province. In 58 B.C., the Gallic leaders begged Caesar to help them repel a German invasion. Caesar complied and named his own reward. Caesar and Augustus reorganized Gaul into 4 provinces: Gallia Narbonensis in the south, known to the Romans as Provincia, and to us as Provence, then largely Hellenized through the Greek settlements on the Mediterranean coast. Aquitania in the southwest, chiefly Iberian in population. In the center, Gallia Lugdunensis, overwhelmingly Celtic, and in the northeast, Belgica, predominantly German. Rome recognized and abetted these ethnic divisions to forestall united revolt. The tribal cantons were retained as administrative areas. The magistrates were chosen by owners of property, whose allegiance was secured by Rome's support of them against the lower classes, and Roman citizenship was granted as a prize to loyal and useful Gauls. A provincial assembly of representatives chosen from every canton met each year in Lyon. At first it limited itself cautiously to the ritual of Augustan worship, but soon it passed on to sending requests to the Roman governors, then recommendations, then demands. The administration of justice was taken out of the hands of the Druids, who were suppressed, and France received Roman law. For almost a century, Gaul submitted peacefully to the new yoke. For a moment in AD 68 and again in 71, revolt flared under Vindex and Civilis, but the people gave scant support to these movements, and the love of liberty yielded to the enjoyment of prosperity, security, and peace. Under the Pax Romana, Gaul became one of the richest parts of the empire. Rome marveled at the wealth of the Gallic nobles who entered the Senate under Claudius, and a century later Florus contrasted the flourishing economy of Gaul with the decline of Italy. Forests were cleared, swamps were drained, agriculture was improved even to the introduction of a mechanical reaper, and the grape and the olive spread into every canton of Gaul. Already in the 1st century, Pliny and Columella praised the wines of Burgundy and Bordeaux. There were large estates tilled by serfs and slaves and owned by the forerunners of medieval feudal lords. But there were also many small proprietors, and wealth was more evenly distributed in ancient Gaul, as in modern France, than in almost any other civilized state. Progress was especially rapid in industry. By AD 200, Gallic potters and ironworkers were stealing the markets of Germany and the West from Italy. Gallic weavers were doing the largest textile business in the empire, and the factories of Lyon were turning out not only commercial glass, but wares of artistic excellence. Industrial techniques were handed down from father to son and formed a precious part of the classical heritage. Over 13,000 miles of road, built or improved by Roman engineers, teemed with transport and trade. Enriched with this expanded economic life, the towns of ancient Celtica became the cities of Roman Gaul. In Aquitania, the capital, Perdigola, now Bordeaux, was one of the busiest of Atlantic ports. Limonum, now Limoges, Avaricum, now Bourges, and Augustinemetum, now Clermont-Ferrand, were already rich. The last paid Zenodortus 400,000 sesterces for a colossus of mercury. In Gallia Narbonensis there were so many cities that Pliny described it as more like Italy than a province. Farthest west was Tolosa, now Toulouse, famous for its schools. Narbo, now Narbonne, capital of the province, was in our 1st century the greatest city of Gaul, the chief port of exit for Gallic goods to Italy and Spain. Here, Sidonius Apollinaris would say, are walls, promenades, taverns, arches, porticos, a forum, a theatre, temples, baths, markets, meadows, lakes, a bridge, and the sea. Farthest east, on the great Via Domitia from Spain to Italy, lay Nemosis, now Nîmes. Its pretty maison carrée was raised by Augustus and the town to commemorate his grandsons Lucius and Caius Caesar. Its inner colonnade is lamentably sunk into the cellar wall, but its free Corinthian columns are as lovely as any in Rome. The amphitheatre, which seated 20,000, is still the scene of periodical pageantry. The Roman aqueduct that brought Nîmes fresh water became in time the Pont du Gard, or Bridge of the Gard River. Standing today as a gigantic ruin in the rugged countryside beyond the city, its massive lower arches contrast to fine effect with the smaller arches above them to make the structure a revealing witness of Rome's engineering art. Eastward on the Mediterranean, at the mouth of the Rhone, Caesar founded Arelati, now Arles, in the hope that it would replace rebellious Massalia as a shipbuilding center and port. Massalia, now Marseille, already old when Caesar was born, remained Greek in language and culture until his death. Through its harbor, Hellenic agriculture, arboriculture, viticulture, and culture had entered Gaul. Here, above all, Western Europe exchanged its goods for those of the classic world. It was one of the great university centers of the empire, especially renowned for its school of law. It declined after Caesar, but maintained its ancient status as a free city, independent of the provincial governor. Farther east were Forum Iulii, now Frejus, Antipolis, now Antibes, and Nicaea, now Nice. This in the little province of the maritime Alps. Sailing up the Rhone from Arelati, the traveler came to Avenio, now Avignon, and Arausio, now Orange. Here a powerful arch survives from Augustus's days, and an immense Roman theatre still hears ancient plays. The largest of the Gallic provinces was Gallia Lugdunensis, named from Lugdunum, now Lyon, its capital. Situated at the confluence of the Rhone and the Saône, and at the crossing of great highways built by Agrippa, The city became the trading center of a rich region and the capital of all Gaul. Iron, glass, and ceramic industries helped to sustain a population of 200,000 in our 1st century. Northward lay Cabellonum, now Chalon-sur-Saône, Caesaridunum, now Tours, Augustodunum, now Autun, Cenabum, now Orléans, and Lutetia, now Paris. "I have spent the winter of 357 to 58, writes the Emperor Julian, in our beloved Lutetia, for so the Gauls term the little town of Parisii, a small island in the river. Good wine is grown here." Belgica, which included parts of France and Switzerland, was almost entirely agricultural. Its industry was for the most part attached to the villas whose numerous remains suggest a baronial life of comfort and luxury. Here Augustus founded the cities now known as Soissons, Saint-Quentin, Senlis, Beauvais, and Trèves. The last, Augusta Treverorum, rose to prominence as the headquarters of the army defending the Rhine. Under Diocletian, it replaced Lyon as the capital of Gaul, and in the 5th century it was the greatest city north of the Alps. It is still rich in classic remains: the Porta Nigra in its Roman wall, the Baths of St. Barbara, the tomb of the Secundini family at nearby Igel, and the crude reliefs on the fortress blocks of neighboring Numagen. In and around these towns, life slowly changed its surface and obstinately renewed its elements. The Gauls kept their character, their breeches, and for 3 centuries their language. Latin triumphed in the 6th century, chiefly through its use by the Roman Church, but it was already being clipped and nosed into French. In Gaul, Rome achieved her greatest triumph in the transmission of civilization. Great French historians like Julian and Funck-Brentano have thought that France would have fared better without the Roman conquest, but a still greater historian believed that the Roman conquest was the sole alternative to a German conquest of Gaul. If Caesar had not won there, says Mommsen, the migration of peoples would have occurred 400 years sooner than it did, and would have come at a time when Italian civilization had not become naturalized either in Gaul, or on the Danube, or in Africa and Spain. Inasmuch as the great Roman general and statesman with sure glance perceived in the German tribes the rival antagonists of the Romano-Greek world, inasmuch as with firm hand he established the new system of aggressive defense, down even to its details, and taught men to protect the frontiers of the empire by rivers and artificial ramparts, he gained for the Greco-Roman culture the interval necessary to civilize the West. The Rhine was the frontier between classic and primitive civilization. Gaul could not defend that frontier. Rome did, and that fact determined the history of Europe to this day. 5. Britain. About 1200 BC, a branch of the Celts crossed over from Gaul and settled in England. They found there a mingled population of dark-haired people, possibly Iberian, and light-haired Scandinavians. They conquered these natives, married them, and spread through England and Wales. About 100 BC, for so the egocentric foreshortening of history telescopes eventful centuries and erases vital generations from a crowded memory, another branch of Celts came from the continent and dispossessed their kinsmen of southern and eastern Britain. When Caesar came, he found the island peopled by several independent tribes, each with its expansive king. He gave to all the population the name Britanni, from a Gallic tribe, so called, just south of the Channel, in the belief that the same tribe inhabited both shores. Celtic Britain was in customs, language, and religion essentially like Celtic Gaul, but its civilization was less advanced. It passed from bronze to iron some 6 centuries before Christ, 3 centuries after Gaul. Pythias, the Massiliot explorer, sailing the Atlantic to England about 350 BC, found the Cantii of Kent already prosperous with agriculture and trade. The soil was fertile from abundant rain and contained rich ores of copper, iron, tin, and lead. By Caesar's time, domestic industry was able to supply an active commerce among the tribes and with the continent, and coins were minted in bronze and gold. His invasions were reconnaissance raids. He brought back the double assurance that the tribes were incapable of united resistance and that the crops were adequate to feed an invading army coming at the proper time. A century later, in AD 43, Claudius crossed the Channel with 40,000 men whose discipline, armament, and skill proved too much for the natives. Britain in her turn became a Roman province. In 61, a British tribal queen, Boudica or Boadicea, led a furious revolt, alleging that Roman officers had ravished both her daughters, plundered her realm and sold many of its freemen into slavery. While the Roman governor Paulinus was busy conquering the Isle of Man, Boudicca's army overcame the single legion that opposed it and marched upon Londinium, already, says Tacitus, the chief residence of merchants and a great mart of trade. Every Roman found there or in Verulamium, now St. Albans, was killed. 70,000 Romans and their allies were slain before Paulinus and his legions caught up with the rebel force. Boudicca, standing with her daughters in a chariot, fought heroically in defeat. She drank poison, and 80,000 Britons were put to the sword. Tacitus tells how his father-in-law, Agricola, as governor of Britain from AD 78 to 84, brought civilization to a rude, scattered, and warlike people by establishing schools, spreading the use of Latin, and encouraging cities and rich men to build temples, basilicas, and public baths. By degrees, says the caustic historian, the charms of vice gained admission to British hearts. Baths, porticos, and elegant banquets grew into vogue, and the new manners, which in reality only served to sweeten slavery, were by the unsuspecting Britons called the arts of polished humanity. In swift campaigns, Agricola carried these arts and Roman rule to the Clyde and the Forth, defeated an army of 30,000 Scots, and wished to go farther when Domitian recalled him. Hadrian built a wall, from 122 to 27, 70 miles across the island from Solway Firth to the mouth of the Tyne as a defense against not unsuspecting Scots. And 20 years later, Lollius raised farther north the 33-mile wall of Antoninus between the Firths of Clyde and Forth. For over 2 centuries, these fortifications kept Britain safe for Rome. As Rome's rule achieved stability, it became more lenient. The cities were managed by native senates, assemblies, and magistrates, and the countryside was left, as in Gaul, to tribal chieftains amenable to Roman surveillance. It was not so urban a civilization as Italy's, nor so rich as Gaul's, but it was under Roman stimulus and protection that most British cities now took form. 4 of them were Roman colonies, whose freemen enjoyed Roman citizenship. Cumulodunum, now Colchester, the first Roman capital of Britain and the seat of the provincial council; Lindum, whose modern name Lincoln, with its ending coln, declares its ancient privilege; Eboracum, now York, an important military post; and Glevum, whose name Gloucester merges Glevum with Chester, the Anglo-Saxon word for town. Chester, Winchester, Dorchester, Chichester, Leicester, Silchester, and Manchester appear to have had their beginnings in the first 2 centuries of Roman rule. These were small towns, each with some 6,000 souls, but they had paved and drained streets, forums, basilicas, temples, and houses with stone foundations and tiled roofs. Viraconium, now Wroxeter, had a basilica accommodating 6,000 persons, and public baths where hundreds could bathe at once. The hot springs of Aequisalus, or salt waters, now Bath, made it a fashionable resort in ancient days, as its surviving thermae show. Londinium rose to economic and military importance because of its position on the Thames and its radiating roads. It grew to a population of 60,000 and soon replaced Camulodunum as Britain's capital. Most of the homes in Roman London were of brick and stucco, in smaller towns of wood. Climate determined their architecture, a gable roof to shed rain and snow, and many windows to let in whatever sun might shine. For even on clear days, said Strabo, the sun is to be seen only for 3 or 4 hours. But interiors followed the Roman style: mosaic floors, large bathrooms, muraled walls, and, far more than in Italian homes, central heating by hot air conduits in walls and floors. Coal, mined from surface veins, was used not only for warming houses, but for industrial processes like smelting lead. Apparently the mines of ancient Britain were owned by the state, but were leased to private entrepreneurs. There was a factory, or fabrica, at Bath for the manufacture of iron weapons, and probably the making of pottery, bricks, and tiles had reached the factory stage. But most industries were carried on in homes, small shops, and villas. 5,000 miles of Roman roads and innumerable waterways were the arteries of a brisk internal trade. A modest foreign commerce, inverting the custom of Britain today, exported raw materials for manufactured goods. How deeply did Roman civilization, in its 4 centuries of domination, penetrate the life and soul of Britain? Latin became the language of politics, law, literature, and the educated minority. But in the countryside and among many workers in the towns, the Celtic tongue survived. Even now in Wales and the Isle of Man it holds its own. Roman schools in Britain spread literacy and determined the Roman form of the English alphabet, and a stream of Latin words poured into English speech. Temples were built to Roman gods, but the common man cherished his Celtic deities and feasts. Even in the cities, Rome sank no lasting roots. The people submitted apathetically to a rule that brought them a fructifying peace and such prosperity as the island would not experience again until the Industrial Revolution. 6. The Barbarians. The decisions of Augustus and Tiberius not to attempt the conquest of Germany were among the pivotal events of European history. Had Germany been conquered and Romanized like Gaul, nearly all Europe west of Russia would have had one organization, one government, one classic culture, perhaps one tongue, and Central Europe might have served as a buffer against those eastern hordes whose pressure upon the Germans caused the Germanic invasions of Italy. We call them Germans, but they themselves have never used this name, and no one knows when it came. They were in classic days a medley of independent tribes occupying Europe between the Rhine and the Vistula, between the Danube and the North and Baltic seas. Gradually, in the 2 centuries from Augustus to Aurelius, they passed from migratory hunting and herding to agriculture and village life. But they were still so far nomadic that they had rapidly exhausted the land they tilled and then moved on to conquer new acres by the sword. If we may believe Tacitus, war was the Germans' meat and drink. To cultivate the earth and wait the regular produce of the seasons is not the maxim of a German. You will more readily persuade him to attack the enemy and provoke honorable wounds on the field of battle. To earn by the sweat of your brow what you might gain at the price of your blood is, in the opinion of a German, a sluggish principle, unworthy of a soldier. The Roman historian, lamenting the deterioration of his own people under luxury and peace, described with the exaggeration of a moralist the martial qualities of the Germans and the ardor with which the women spurred them into battle, often fighting by their side. Flight from the enemy meant lifelong disgrace, in many cases suicide. Strabo described the Germans as wilder and taller than the Gauls, and Seneca, as if he had read Tacitus, drew ominous conclusions. To those vigorous bodies, to those souls unwitting of pleasures, luxury, and wealth, add but a little more tactical skill and discipline. I say no more. You Romans will only be able to hold your own against them by returning to the virtues of your sires. In peace, Tacitus reports, these warriors were correspondingly indolent. The men spent their time, presumably after hunting or harvesting, in eating heavy meals of meat and drinking rivers of beer, while the women and children did the work of the home. The German bought his wife from her father by a gift of cattle or weapons. He had the power of life and death over her and their children, subject to the approval of the tribal assembly. Nevertheless, women were held in high honor, were often asked to decide tribal disputes, and were as free to divorce their husbands as these were to divorce them. Some chieftains had several wives, but the usual German family was monogamous and maintained, we are assured, a lofty level of marital morality. Adultery was seldom heard of, and was punished in the woman by cutting off her hair and driving her naked through the streets to be flogged as she fled. The wife was allowed to practice abortion if she wished, but normally she bore many children. A man without children was so rare that wills were not made. It was assumed that the property of the family would go down from father to son, generation after generation. 4 classes composed the population. This book is continued at this point on the other side of this cassette. Please reverse or turn the cassette over now.